Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode is a throwback to a prior time when grizzlies and humans existed and competed on much more even footing, if there could be such a thing with a massive and powerful animal. In the Old West, grizzlies terrorized remote ranches with relative impunity, and southeast Idaho was no exception. This episode takes place near a small town called Soda Springs, just north of the Idaho Utah border, but extends and concludes into North Utah, near what is today Logan County and the thriving city of Logan, Utah. This area used to be filled to the brim with big old grizzly bears, and may still have a few. The Cache National Forest of today is a sprawling and primitive forest system which at the time sheltered a grizzly of great cunning, appetite, and power. The steep mountains here are packed with stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, interrupted by quaking aspen wherever there is water. Along creeks, streams, and ponds you will find willows and other dense bushes acting as screens for wildlife including mule deer, elk, and moose. The predators of this area include coyotes, cougars, black bears, but no longer include big old grizzly bears. On August 22, 1923, a grizzly hunter by the name of Frank Clark was following a very unique set of bear tracks. He had been stalking a bear known as Old Ephraim for several years, for 9 years to be precise. Frank was born in Cherry Creek, Idaho, which is still on the state map today, surprisingly. Most small towns from back then have disappeared, but not Cherry Creek. Clark was part owner of the Ward Clark Sheep Company, and the company had been experiencing a damaging influence on its bottom line. It seemed there was a cunning and hungry grizzly bear taking down the sheep numbers of the company as they grazed the mountains. Now, sheep aren't the brightest of animals, which is probably what makes them such good farm animals and bear food. We all know the valuable and useful wool they yield each year, which can be made into warm socks, gloves, hats, and other garments, but they can also be a source of meat to humans and bears alike. Over the last several years, Old Ephraim had taken down and eaten untold numbers of domestic sheep from the area, and sheep farmers were at their wits' end in dealing with him. He would outsmart every attempt at catching or killing him by sniffing out human scent on any traps left in his many wallows. Whenever he found a trap, he would carefully pull the trap from the mud and fling it aside, allowing him to cool off in the muddy water. He was also a master of disappearing. Each time he would strike, his incursions would be marked with partially eaten sheep and his unique three-toed tracks, but hunters wouldn't find hide nor hair of the massive bear. Each time they followed his tracks, he would disappear into the vast wilderness area along the state border, just to resurface somewhere else and wreak havoc on sheep herds there. Legend has it that at one of his raids, Old Ephraim went around swatting and biting sheep in a bloodthirsty rampage that killed 50 sheep in a single night. As you can imagine, this took a toll on the sheep farmers, and getting rid of Old Ephraim was a main topic of conversation whenever they got together. Back in those days, local police and sheriff's deputies were trying to catch outlaws, and were too busy to focus on killing a grizzly. That dangerous work was left up to ranchers and farmers themselves. Clark had worked on developing and understanding Old Ephraim's pattern of hunting and killing sheep. Typically, the giant bear would sneak into a sheep herd and kill a single sheep, then carry it off into the brush, a great distance to consume it alone. At first, this behavior was a nuisance more than anything. Taking a single sheep from a herd might go unnoticed for a while by a sheepherder, but add it all up over a summer, and that herd might be down several head by the end. Old Ephraim was cunning, in that he wouldn't return to the same sheep herd that he had hit any time recently. He would wander many miles to find his next meal from another herd, and disappear before his antics could get him killed. This elusive and calculating behavior was a statement on how well he understood the behavior of sheepherders. Somehow the big old bear knew that if he spent too much time in one place, he would be on the receiving end of some very fast lead projectiles aimed at bringing his herd-raiding antics to an end, so he continually moved from herd to herd. On July 13, 1911, Clark had moved his operation into the wilderness area along the state border and immediately began to lose sheep to Old Ephraim. In fact, in a single grazing season, the old bear took his herds down 154 sheep. Shepherds knew it was him by his three-toed track, which was apparently a birth defect and not due to an injury from a trap, so common back then. The first thing Clark noticed about Old Ephraim's raid on the shepherds was that he would eat nearly all of the sheep carcass, unlike other bears in the area. He wasn't wasteful or a wanton killer, but apparently very hungry and couldn't find easier game than the numerous and easy-to-capture sheep. Clark recalled a particularly impressive run-in with Old Ephraim in his memoirs. He stated that the giant bear was making off with an entire sheep when the shepherd caught him in the act. Clark fired his .25-35 rifle several times at the bear, but apparently missed him with each shot, which he blamed on the fact that the bear was headed straight up a steep hill with the sheep. Clark decided then that this bear must be stopped and immediately began placing steel-jawed traps in bear wallows he found in Old Ephraim's territory. Time after time, the traps would be sprung with no sign of the bear. On other occasions, Clark would find the traps painstakingly dragged from the wallow and set aside, so that Old Ephraim was afforded a refreshing mud bath in peace. Clark came to realize that Old Ephraim wasn't your typical grizzly, but was very intelligent, deliberate, and careful. These traits would make him very hard to trap and kill, as the shepherd would find out over the course of several years. While pursuing Old Ephraim, Clark would recall killing over 50 bears, but none of them had the distinctive tracks of the old giant bear. Bear wallows were scattered about the area, and Old Ephraim would travel his territory and take mud baths in whichever wallow was convenient. Each time, Clark would think he had the bear, but his effort would come up fruitless, and he would head back to the drawing board for his next effort. On August 21, 1923, Clark had noticed that Old Ephraim had returned to a wallow very familiar to him. The bear had dug out the wallow to suit his enormous size and had enjoyed bathing in the mud a few days prior to Clark finding it. Clark developed a new strategy to employ his bear traps and set the wallow up, hoping one last time that Old Ephraim would miss some detail that would lead to his capture and death. Clark pitched his camp about 1 mile uphill from the wallow and waited. He figured he could check the trap at the wallow each day until the bear was caught or had moved on. On the night in question, the peace of the early morning was shattered by a deafening roar from the direction of the trap-encircled bear wallow. Frank knew by the roar, which was followed by a long, sorrowful moan, that a bear had found the business end of one of his bear traps. But was it Old Ephraim? Now, Clark knew that if the bear was caught in the trap, it would be there in the morning, so he closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't return. He knew he had to answer that nagging question in his mind, so he grabbed his .25-35 rifle and the ball ammunition it fired, and set out toward the trap without even putting on his trousers. As Clark navigated the trail toward the wallow in the dark, he heard a chain rattle behind him. When he was setting the trap, he had anchored it to a large log with a 14-foot chain to make sure any bear caught in it wouldn't go far, but the giant bear had already made his way in part toward Clark's tent and was now in the creek, between the man and his camp. Clark listened in the dark, waiting for more clues as to the precise location of the bear. His teeth rattled just as much as the chain each time the bear moved. Clark's dog Ginny hadn't alerted him to the bear, as she was too afraid of a confrontation with it. Clark could hear the bear thrashing the log and chain around in the creek, but knew it was far too dark to approach him. He made his way up the hill a ways and listened to the bear roar and groan until daylight. As soon as dawn broke, Clark knew he had a huge advantage on the bear, which any hunter would need. Clark searched the thick willow stands for the bear, but couldn't find Old Ephraim's location. The bear had laid up along the creek bank for a nap after a night of roaring and dragging the log around had exhausted him. Clark knew he didn't want to be surprised by the bear, so he picked up sticks and tossed them into any thick willows or deadwood he could come upon. At one point, a stick apparently landed near the giant bear and flushed him upstream, very near Clark's tent. Old Ephraim crawled into some tightly packed willows just a few yards from Clark's camp and wouldn't be flushed from it again. Clark searched the willow patch and could see a patch of the bear's fur, and figured if it was the only shot he had, he would take it. He fired his rifle and grazed Old Ephraim's shoulder. The wound made the giant bear stand to his feet with his back to Clark. Clark could see the 14-foot-long chain that held the trap to the log completely wrapped around the bear's right front paw. Together with a 23-pound trap, the bear was holding up close to 100 pounds over his head, as if it were nothing. Then he turned around to face the man, with only a few yards separating them. Clark knew that Old Ephraim could have bolted, even with the heavy chain and log and trap firmly affixed to his paw. As the bear glared at him, Clark was filled with terror, so much so that he couldn't raise his rifle. He would later state that the bear was the most magnificent sight any man could see. Instead of trying to dash toward Clark, the 9-foot, 11-inch tall grizzly walked on his hind legs toward him, waving the heavy trap around above his head. The man knew that the bear wouldn't be able to step over a pile of deadfall between them, but Clark was still paralyzed with fear. The experienced woodsman had never had such an intense confrontation with a bear the size of Old Ephraim. He couldn't move or react until the bear approached to within 6 feet of him. Clark pushed his rifle forward toward the bear and pulled the trigger without aiming. Old Ephraim fell backward and onto his rear, stunned for a few seconds. The .25-35 rifle Clark was using to try to dispatch Old Ephraim was far too small to kill a bear of this size effectively. The giant bear quickly regained his feet and began to walk toward Clark once again. His rifle held a total of 7 rounds, and Clark quickly went through 5 of the 6 remaining cartridges, while the bear staggered toward him. Just as Old Ephraim crossed the trail that separated him from Clark, the man decided to hit the trail himself. He began to run downhill and figured he wouldn't stop until he reached Logan, 20 miles away. Clark turned to look, and Old Ephraim was still on his hind legs following him. This time Jenny had found her courage and was nipping at his heels as he pursued Clark. After a short but slow pursuit, Clark found enough courage to turn and face Old Ephraim. He approached the bear, who was still walking on his hind legs toward him. Clark could see blood squirting from the bear's massive nose each time it breathed. He knew Old Ephraim was injured severely and thought maybe he would avoid a severe mauling after all. Clark raised his rifle one last time and aimed for the softened spot underneath its jaw. There are no bones there until the base of the skull, and this bullet hit pay dirt. The giant bear piled up, dead, after several shots from the underpowered rifle fired by the shepherd. Clark was immediately filled with regret at terminating the beautiful giant bear. He felt a sudden longing for human company, but was utterly alone, as the horses had been scared away during the hunt. Eventually, Clark found one of his horses tangled up in a nearby wash. He hopped onto its back and rode 3 miles to a nearby herder's camp. He rested there and replenished his fortitude before returning to where he had left Old Ephraim. The shepherd returned with Clark to examine the bear and help in skinning it. The men dug a hole and buried Old Ephraim's remains, only taking his hide as a keepsake. Once the death of the legend got out, a group of Boy Scouts from Troop 43 planned and executed a trip to exhume Old Ephraim's bones, or at least his skull. They commented that it was very stinky and packed it out stuck on the end of a long pole to maintain safe smelling distance from the skull. They submitted the bear's enormous skull to the Smithsonian Institute, which eventually returned it to Utah State University. It is still displayed at the Merrill Library. Clark recalled that Old Ephraim had bit a 6-inch thick aspen log in 2 pieces with a single bite on one occasion. In another example of his biting power, he had bit a 13-foot-long pine log, 12 inches in diameter, into 11 pieces. The wood looked as if it had been chopped into firewood. Today, Old Ephraim's memory lives on. The winner of the Bear 100-mile endurance race is awarded the Old Ephraim Award for Toughness. A life-size bronze statue stands along U.S. Route 89 near Montpelier, Idaho. In 2014, it was updated with a statue including the bear trap, which is a key part of the legend. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, B Company, 16th Battalion's 3rd Signal Brigade created and awarded the Old Ephraim Award annually to the soldier best exemplifying his fighting spirit. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Prior to this episode, had you heard of the Legend of Old Ephraim? Would you like to be a shepherd back near the turn of the last century? Why do you think it took so many shots to take Old Ephraim down? Are you going to try to bite a 6-inch thick aspen branch in 2 to see if you can bite through it? If you do, make sure to take a picture and send it to me. As always, I will enjoy reading and replying to your thoughts, so please post them below and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We've slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.